The wind off the Black Sea smelled of salt, tar, and something else that autumn. Matteo di Ruggiero would remember that later. Not at once. Not while he stood on the western wall of Caffa, squinting past the crenellations toward the Mongol campfires that ringed the city like a necklace of dull red stars. Not while he counted arrows. Not while he listened to the Genoese captain curse the Tartars in a low, exhausted voice. Only later would he recall that the wind had carried a sweetness he could not name. Caffa lay on the Crimean coast, a Genoese outpost thrust into a Mongol world. It was a city of warehouses and counting houses, of church bells and market cries in a dozen tongues. Spices from the east passed through its gates. Silks, furs, slaves, and grain moved under its cranes. The harbor was thick with masts, and now the harbor was nearly empty. The siege had tightened through the summer of 1347. The Mongol army, subjects of the Khan of the Golden Horde, had come in force, angry over trade disputes and broken agreements. At first, the Genoese had trusted their walls. They were merchants, not knights, but their walls were thick and their crossbows well made. Trade, they believed, would resume when tempers cooled. That was the first quiet contradiction, for even as merchants balanced ledgers and priests rang the Angelus, something moved through the Mongol camp beyond the range of crossbow bolt. It began, as such things often do, with rumor. Men whispered that the Tartars were dying in their tents, that entire companies had collapsed, that the Khan himself had been stricken. Matteo heard it from a dock boy who heard it from a man who had crept out at night to spy beyond the ditch. They fall like flies, the boy said, half frightened, half triumphant. Matteo spat over the wall. Good, he said. Let them fall. He did not yet understand what was falling. The siege had already gnawed at the city. Grain stores ran low. Fresh water grew brackish. Prices rose in the market, and the poor ate less. Matteo shared a room near the harbor with 2 other sailors. They took turns sleeping, one always half alert for the sound of bells. And then, one morning, something arced over the wall. It was not a stone. It struck the cobbles with a wet sound. Matteo turned. The thing had burst open on impact. A smell rose, heavy and wrong. A body. More followed. According to later accounts, the Mongols, desperate and enraged, had begun hurling their dead over the walls with catapults. Hecker describes the episode as one of the turning points in the plague's passage westward, noting how disease among the besiegers preceded catastrophe within the city. Matteo did not know Hecker. He knew only that the air had changed. The Genoese authorities ordered the bodies removed and burned. Fire smoked for days. Priests walked in procession, swinging censers thick with incense. The smoke of pitch and flesh mingled with frankincense. Matteo helped drag a corpse by the ankles to the pyre outside the church of St. Nicholas. He tried not to look at the face. The skin was darkened, the features swollen. He told himself it was only rot. Zigarot, Orntuan, the natural consequence of death. Mendi inva, Fort, Sufres, Meteordunwan. That is no omen. But within a week, men began dying inside the walls. At first it was a servant in a merchant's house, then a dock worker, then a woman who sold figs near the quay. They sickened quickly. Fever, pain in the groin and armpit, swellings that frightened even seasoned sailors. Gasquet later catalogued these signs in Sicily, but here in Caffa they were only terror without explanation. Matteo visited one of the stricken, a fellow sailor named Paolo. Paolo lay on a pallet, sweating, whispering prayers. His neck bore a dark swelling like an egg beneath the skin. "It is the bad air," Paolo rasped. "The Tartars fouled it." "Rest," Matteo said. He dipped a cloth in water and pressed it to his friend's brow. Paolo was dead by morning. The city council convened. Ships were to be readied. Those that could sail would sail. Better to trust the sea than the wall. Better to brave storms than this invisible enemy. Matteo did not hesitate. He had signed onto a small galley bound originally for Trebizond, then Genoa. Now its captain ordered it provisioned for immediate departure. Cargo was abandoned in warehouses. Silk bales lay forgotten. On the morning they cast off, the harbor was choked with departing vessels. Sails unfurled in frantic succession. The sea beyond the breakwater shimmered, indifferent. Matteo stood at the rail as Caffa receded. Smoke still rose from the pyres within the wall. Bells tolled, though whether for the dead or for farewell, he could not say. He crossed himself. "We are saved," said the man beside him. Matteo nodded. The wind filled the sails. They did not know that something else had already taken passage. The sea was calm for 3 days. That, more than anything, made Matteo uneasy. He had sailed in storms that snapped oars like twigs. He had watched lightning split the horizon from mast to mast. He trusted a storm. A storm declared itself. It shouted its intentions. This sea was mild as oil. The galley cut southward along the Crimean coast before angling west. Behind them, other Genoese ships followed, some larger, some limping. From the deck one could still see the faint line of Caffa's walls on the first day, pale against the land. By the second, there was nothing but water and sky. They had loaded hastily, barrels of salted fish, hard biscuit, a little wine, fewer crew than usual. Several men had refused to board, choosing to hide in the city. Matteo wondered what became of them. He did not dwell on it. On the 4th day, one of the oarsmen failed to rise. He was a quiet Ligurian named Stefano, broad-shouldered, rarely talkative. Matteo found him curled on his bench, shivering though the sun had already warmed the deck. His eyes were unfocused. Too much wine, someone muttered. But when Stefano tried to stand, he cried out. His hand flew to his groin. Matteo saw the swell there, beneath the coarse cloth. Not rot, not hunger. The same swelling Paolo had borne. The captain ordered Stefano moved to the stern, near the tiller, away from the main benches. The men obeyed without protest. They did not yet speak the word plague. They said fever. They said bad air from Caffa clung to his clothes. Matteo brought him water. You should not, whispered the ship's priest, a thin Dominican brother named Fra Luca. If it is catching. Is it? Matteo asked. Fra Luca hesitated. His face was pale. God tests in many ways. That was not an answer. The Oxford scholars would later write of how medieval Christians understood disease, not merely as bodily misfortune, but as part of a larger divine order. Illness could be punishment, purification, or mystery. It was not meaningless. In 1347, men did not ask whether God was involved. They asked only how. That night, Stefano's breathing grew ragged. He muttered in his sleep, calling for his mother. Matteo sat near him until dawn. By morning, Stefano was dead. They wrapped him in sailcloth. No time for bells, no soil for burial. The captain murmured a prayer, brief and formal. Matteo felt something tighten in his chest as they slid the body overboard. The sea accepted him without comment. 3 days later, another man sickened. Then, another. The calm held. The sky was a steady blue dome. The sun rose and set with indifferent precision. Matteo began to notice the pattern, the swellings, the fever, the swift decline. Gasquet, writing centuries later about Sicily, would describe how victims seemed healthy at dawn and dying by dusk. Matteo saw it now, in the rhythm of the ship. The captain grew stern. We will not turn back, he said. There is nothing to turn back to. No one argued. They steered for Constantinople, hoping to reprovision and perhaps find physicians. But word traveled faster than sails. As they approached the Bosporus, they saw smoke rising from the city, not siege smoke, but the haze of many fires. A fishing vessel passed them at a distance. Its crew shouted warnings across the water. Matteo caught only fragments. Death. Streets empty. Emperor's men ill. Even the great city of Constantine was stricken. Hecker, chronicling the spread, would later note how the disease moved along trade routes with uncanny fidelity, from the Crimea to Constantinople, from port to port, as if guided by the very arteries of commerce. Matteo did not know he sailed within history. He knew only that doors were closing. They did not dock. The captain feared being trapped in quarantine or blamed for bringing illness. So they skirted the city and pressed onward into the Aegean. By now, half the original crew remained fit for duty. The others were sick or gone. Matteo's hands blistered from double shifts at the oars. At night he lay awake listening to the coughs and low moans in the darkness. The smell below deck thickened. Sweat, bilge water, something sour. He examined his own body each morning. No swelling, no fever. He touched his neck, his armpits, his groin. Nothing. Why them, and not me? He began to pray more deliberately, not the hurried crossing of himself before meals, but slow, measured prayers. He recited the Pater Noster until he could no longer feel his lips move. Fra Luca preached on deck one evening as the sun lowered. "This is a scourge," the friar said softly, "perhaps for pride, perhaps for greed. We are merchants in a violent world. But remember, suffering is not always wrath. Sometimes it is mercy we cannot yet see. Mercy. Matteo thought of Paolo's swollen neck, of Stefano slipping into the sea. He did not argue with the friar. Yet he felt the contradiction settle inside him like ballast. If this was mercy, it was a quiet one. A week later, they sighted Sicily. The island rose from the horizon like a promise. Green slopes, pale cliffs, the faint outline of a harbor. Messina, they had traded there before. Matteo remembered noisy taverns near the quay. Sicilian oranges sweet on the tongue, the cathedral bells. As they entered the harbor, Matteo saw that it was busy, though not as crowded as in past seasons. Fishing boats bobbed. Merchants stood on the docks watching the incoming vessels. They must have looked a sorry sight. Patched sails, gaunt faces, too few men at the oars. A harbor official hailed them. "From where do you sail?" "Caffa," the captain answered. A murmur passed along the dock. Matteo felt relief flood him. Land a dart, the solid ground, fresh water, physicians, rest. Why? He did not see the fear in the Sicilian's eyes. He did not know that within days the city would remember this arrival as the beginning of its undoing. As the gangplank lowered, Matteo stepped onto the stones of Messina, believing at last that he had outrun death. The bells of the cathedral began to ring. Messina smelled of citrus and salt. For Matteo, the scent was almost enough to make him weep. After weeks at sea, the solidity of the quay felt unreal beneath his boots. The Sicilian sun was softer than the hard glare of the Black Sea. Merchants stood in loose clusters, speaking quickly in dialects Matteo could half understand. Dockhands eyed the Genoese galley with suspicion. "How many?" one of them asked, nodding toward the ship. The captain did not answer directly. "We require water, bread, and a physician." The harbor official hesitated. "There are rumors," he said carefully. "From the east." "There are always rumors," the captain replied. Yet even as he spoke, two sailors behind Matteo staggered. One gripped the railing. The other pressed a hand to his side, face gray. They had concealed the worst of the sickness during docking. Pride, envy, fear, perhaps denial. But now there was no hiding it. The first man collapsed onto the stones. A small circle formed at once. Not too close. Matteo knelt beside him. The man's skin burned. His breathing rattled, shallow and fast. Matteo felt the swell beneath his arm when he tried to lift him. A woman gasped. "Madonna." Within hours, word had spread through the harbor quarter. Gasquet later wrote of how the ships from Caffa brought with them a disease that seemed to move with terrible speed. Victims, he recorded, would develop sudden fevers, painful swellings in the groin or armpits, dark spots upon the skin. Many died within 3 days. To the people of Messina, this was not yet history. It was unfolding in the marketplace. The Genoese were ordered to remain aboard. Too late. Now, some of the sick had already disembarked before the severity was understood. One had gone to a tavern, another to a cousin's house near the cathedral. Matteo himself had walked to a fountain and drawn water with his own hands. By evening, 2 Sicilian dock workers were ill. The city council met urgently. There was debate, voices raised, hands striking tables. Expel the ships at once. Force them back to sea. Quarantine the crews. The decision came at dawn. The Genoese vessels were to depart immediately. But departure is not the same as erasure. Matteo stood on deck again, as harbor guards shouted orders from below. Stones were thrown. Not many, but enough. "Go," someone cried. "Take your curse with you." Curse. One. Matteo gripped the rail. Fra Luca stood beside him. "They fear what they cannot see." "Do we see it?" Matteo asked. The friar did not answer. They cast off once more. This time, no one waved farewell. As the galley eased from the harbor, Matteo looked back at Messina's rising streets. The cathedral dome pale against the sky. Bells rang again, but now they rang in alarm. Within days, Messina would change. Gasquet describes how households were struck in quick succession, how neighbors fled from neighbors, how physicians were overwhelmed, and some refused to attend the sick. Matteo did not witness all of this, yet he heard fragments as they lingered offshore, uncertain where next to go. Fishing boats avoided them. A small skiff approached under a white cloth, tied to an oar, a sign of truce. A man within shouted across the water that the sickness had already taken root, that entire families were bedridden, that some claimed it was punishment for sin, others that it was a poisoned wind from the east. Matteo listened in silence. The quiet contradiction grew heavier. They had been expelled as if they alone carried death. Yet the illness had already begun its work within the city walls. Even if every Genoese ship vanished, the fever would not vanish with them. Trade routes were arteries. Blood once set in motion does not ask permission before it flows. The captain resolved to sail north, along the Italian coast. Perhaps Genoa, perhaps another port less fearful. But fear was traveling faster than sails. At night, Matteo lay awake beneath unfamiliar stars. The sea around Sicily was calm, as it had been off Crimea. The calm felt almost deliberate, as though the world wished to appear unchanged. He thought of his mother in Genoa, who kept a small shrine to Saint Roch, protector against pestilence. He thought of the narrow street where he had grown up, the way neighbors leaned from windows to exchange gossip. If the sickness reached there, he stopped the thought. Human scale stakes. That is what this was. Not empires, not chronicles. His mother's kitchen, a wooden table, the smell of bread. On the second night after leaving Messina, Matteo woke to coughing near his palate. It was Fra Luca. The friar sat upright, breathing hard. Sweat dampened his thin hair. When he saw Matteo watching, he attempted a smile. "Just the sea air," he said. Matteo did not believe him. By morning, the friar could not stand. The crew's numbers had dwindled further. Steering required 2 men instead of 1. The sails were trimmed by hands that trembled. They made for Calabria, hoping to find welcome in a smaller harbor. Instead, signal fires burned along the coast. Word had preceded them. Hecker notes that once the plague entered the Mediterranean network, it advanced with remarkable consistency along maritime routes. Ports that received ships from infected regions soon reported outbreaks. Matteo saw only closed harbors and distant flames. They were becoming a ghost ship. Matteo began to wonder whether survival itself had become a burden. Each dawn he examined his body again. Still no swelling. Still no fever. Why them, and not me? He did not voice the question aloud. He feared that to name it would summon its answer. Fra Luca died on the 3rd night, after leaving Messina. Before they consigned him to the sea, Matteo found a small wooden cross among the friar's belongings. He slipped it into his pouch. As the body slid into the dark water, Matteo whispered the prayer the friar had spoken so often. "Into your hands." The words felt thin against the vastness. Ahead lay the Italian coast, uncertain and wary. Behind them, Messina's bells continued to toll. They did not reach Genoa. The winds shifted north, forcing them to tack awkwardly along the coast. Provisions ran thin. The galley's benches stood half empty now, oars unmanned where men had once sweated in rhythm. Matteo moved like someone walking across thin ice, careful, measured, aware that any misstep might plunge him into cold darkness. They found a small inlet near Reggio, little more than a crescent of sand and a scatter of stone houses. No harbor chains blocked them. No signal fires burned in warning. Hope stirred. The captain ordered a cautious approach. Only 2 men were permitted to disembark, Matteo among them. His legs trembled when he stepped onto the sand. It had been days since he had stood on unmoving earth. A few villagers gathered at a distance. Their expressions were guarded, not yet hostile. "We need water," Matteo called. "Bread. Monsieur, we will pay." An older man stepped forward, beard white, eyes sharp. "From where?" "Caffa," Matteo said before he could stop himself. The word hung in the air. The villagers exchanged looks. They had heard of Caffa, of the siege, of ships turned away from Messina. Fear was spreading faster than fever. "We have little to spare," the old man said slowly. "But you may draw from the well. Leave coin there." He pointed with his staff. "No welcome, no handshake." Matteo nodded. He and the other sailor filled casks in silence. Women pulled children indoors as they passed. A dog barked and would not be quieted. As they returned to the galley, Matteo felt the weight of something intangible settling over them. They were no longer merely sailors. They were rumor-made flesh. Back aboard, he counted the living. 9 to Artem. 9 men to manage a vessel meant for twice that number. 9 men to outrun a sickness that did not tire. The captain gathered them near the stern. "We sail for Genoa," he said. "If they bar us, we will try Pisa. If Pisa refuses, perhaps Marseille. We will find harbor." He spoke with confidence, but Matteo saw the strain in his eyes. Trade had always been the lifeblood of the Genoese. Their ships stitched together, ports from the Black Sea to the western Mediterranean. That network had made fortunes. It had built churches and palaces. It had allowed men like Matteo, born in narrow alleys, to see distant horizons. Now that same network seemed to pulse with something darker. Hecker would later trace the pattern from the Crimea to Constantinople to Sicily, then northward through Italian ports and across to southern France. Each node linked by commerce, each link binding communities closer than they knew. Matteo did not think in patterns. He thought of his mother's door. On the 6th day after leaving Sicily, another sailor sickened. The swellings had become familiar now. The fever, unmistakable. The dread, quiet. This time, it was the captain. He tried to hide it, tried to stand through the morning watch. But when he staggered and gripped the rail, Matteo saw the truth. The crew exchanged glances. Authority wavered. The captain beckoned Matteo closer. "If I fall," he said, voice hoarse, "you will see her home." "Home? Why, the ship. No, or Genoa?" "Yes, captain," Matteo answered. That night, the captain raved in delirium. He spoke of ledgers and debts, of silk bales abandoned in Caffa. He cursed the Tartars. He begged forgiveness from someone Matteo could not see. By dawn, he was still. They buried him at sea. Matteo felt no triumph at surviving another man, only a hollow space where certainty had once rested. He took command because someone had to. They adjusted course toward Genoa, sails trimmed with careful hands. The Ligurian coast would come into view within days if the winds held. At sunset, Matteo stood alone at the prow. The sea glowed copper beneath the lowering sun. It was beautiful, so achingly beautiful that for a moment he forgot everything else. How could a world that looked like this conceal such ruin? The contradiction was not quiet now. It pressed against him. Behind them, Sicily would be unraveling. Gasquet writes of how Messina's inhabitants began to flee, carrying the sickness inland, of how priests struggled to administer last rites, of how families locked themselves indoors. Some blamed foreigners, some blamed sin, some simply wept. Ahead Genoa lay unaware, or perhaps not unaware. Rumors traveled by merchant faster than plague. Sometimes, perhaps the harbor would be guarded, perhaps chains would bar entry. Matteo imagined standing before those chains, shouting that he carried no ill will, that he had fled death as any man would. Intent would not matter. On the 10th day, the Ligurian coastline appeared, a faint gray line against the horizon. Men gathered at the rail, silent. Home. Why? As they approached, Matteo saw movement along the harbor mouth. Smaller boats. Signals exchanged. A patrol vessel rowed out to meet them before they could enter. "State your origin," called the officer. Matteo swallowed. "Caffa, Dece." A pause. "You will anchor offshore. No immediate expulsion. No welcome either." They dropped anchor beyond the breakwater. From that distance, Matteo could see the rooftops of Genoa rising in tiers, the cathedral tower, the familiar sweep of the harbor. He could almost see his street. A boat approached bearing officials and a physician masked with cloth soaked in vinegar. They did not board at once. Questions were shouted across the water. How many sick? How many dead? When did the first fall ill? Matteo answered as steadily as he could. The physician conferred with the officials. Then came the decree. No one from the ship would disembark. Not yet. Not. They would remain at anchor, provisioned at distance, watched, quarantined, though the word had not yet taken firm shape in practice. Matteo gripped the rail and stared at the city. So close, so impossibly far. Behind him, below deck, one of the remaining sailors began to cough. The bells of Genoa rang for evening prayer. Matteo closed his eyes and listened. They floated there for 3 days, close enough to smell the bakeries at dawn when the wind turned inland, close enough to hear the cathedral bells marking the hours, close enough for Matteo to recognize the rhythm of his own city breathing, and yet separated by water, by fear, by an invisible line, drawn in caution. Small boats approached at intervals, never touching the hull. Barrels were transferred by rope. Bread, onions, dried beans. A physician shouted instructions across the gap. Keep the sick apart. Burn soiled cloth. Pray. Wancho. As if prayer had not already been worn thin. The Genoese authorities had heard of Messina, of Sicily's sudden calamity. Reports were confused, exaggerated perhaps, but troubling. The Oxford scholars would later note how quickly religious language framed the crisis. Sermons spoke of chastisement, of divine displeasure, of the fragility of earthly prosperity. The very success of Genoa, its trade, its wealth, was now whispered as possible cause. Matteo stood at the rail and watched the harbor traffic continue. Ships arrived from Pisa and Barcelona, unaware or unconcerned. Commerce did not halt easily. It slowed, it hesitated, But it did not cease. A quiet contradiction again. If this was punishment for pride, why did trade still move? Why did the bells ring as always? Why did the market stalls below the city walls still open at dawn? On the second night at anchor, a lantern flickered from a small skiff, approaching after curfew. Matteo's heart pounded. The skiff drew near enough for him to see the figure within, a woman wrapped in a dark cloak. "Matteo," she called softly. His breath left him. "Mama?" He scrambled down the rope ladder halfway before remembering the order not to allow contact. "Stay back," he whispered urgently. "Do not come closer." She did not obey. The skiff bumped gently against the hull before Matteo could stop it. He saw her face clearly now, lined more deeply than when he had last seen it, eyes wide with a fear she tried to mask. "They say you carry death," she said. Not accusation, simple repetition. "We carry no more than any ship," Matteo answered. He did not know if that was true. She reached for his hand. He recoiled, not from her, but from the possibility. "Do not touch me," he said, voice breaking. "Please." For a moment they simply looked at one another across the narrow space of air. "Come home," she whispered. "They will not allow it. Then I will come to you." "No." The word came sharper than he intended. Behind him, one of the crew coughed. A harsh, tearing sound. His mother's gaze flickered toward the noise. "I will pray," she said finally. "I know." She pressed something against the hull, a small bundle tied with twine. Matteo lowered a rope and drew it up after she pushed away. Inside he found dried figs and the small clay rosary that had hung for years beside her bed. He held it as the skiff receded into darkness. He did not know whether he had protected her or condemned her by allowing the boat to touch. By morning, the harbor authorities had learned of the visit. Matteo saw increased patrols along the breakwater. Word spread quickly in a city built on whispers. On the fourth day at anchor, the first case appeared within Genoa. A dock worker who had helped transfer barrels from a provisioning boat fell ill. Then, his wife. Then, a neighbor. Matteo heard it from a shouted exchange between officials. The line had already been crossed. Hecker writes of how plague once established in a port often spread with startling velocity through dense urban quarters. Houses built close, families sharing rooms, markets crowded. These were conditions ripe for transmission, though no one in 1347 understood the mechanism. They understood only proximity. Matteo watched smoke rise from within the city walls. Not siege smoke this time, but funeral pyres hastily built in churchyards. The authorities debated whether to drive the Genoese galley away entirely. Some argued that it was too late. The sickness had entered. Others demanded visible action, an example to calm the frightened. Matteo felt the mood shift like a change in wind. On the sixth day, a delegation approached by boat. City magistrates, a notary, 2 armed guards. "You will depart," the magistrate announced without ceremony. "At once." "To where?" Matteo asked. "That is not our concern. We are Genoese," Matteo said quietly, "and Genoa must be protected." The rope was cut, the anchor raised. As the galley drifted away from the harbor mouth, Matteo stared at the skyline that had shaped his childhood. He could see the cathedral tower where he had once served as an altar boy, the rooftop where he had mended nets with his uncle, now barred. Behind him, below deck, only 6 men remained able to stand. The sea received them again without comment. They turned west toward open water. News would follow them, carried by other ships, by frightened merchants, by refugees fleeing inland. Genoa would soon be as stricken as Messina. Gasquet would later document how cities across Italy saw clergy overwhelmed, graves dug hastily, social bonds strained. Matteo would not read those accounts. He stood at the helm, clay rosary wrapped around his wrist, and steered into the fading light. The question pressed at him now with no answer in sight. Had he escaped death from Caffa, or had Caffa escaped through him? The horizon offered no reply. The Ligurian coast faded into haze behind them. Matteo did not look back again. They sailed west along the Riviera, then southward, keeping distance from major ports. Smaller fishing villages sometimes signaled them away before they came within shouting range. Other times there was only silence, doors shut, beaches empty, as if the shoreline itself had withdrawn. The galley had become lighter in more ways than one. 6 men, 6 thin shadows moving across a vessel meant for many more. The benches stood vacant, the sail hung loose in light wind. Matteo had never known such stillness at sea. He had imagined survival differently. He had imagined noise, reunion, warm bread. Instead, there was endurance. On the third night after leaving Genoa, the youngest of the remaining crew, Luca, barely 17, began to cough. Matteo heard it from the stern. Not the dry clearing of a throat, but something deeper, persistent. He waited. He hoped it was only fatigue. By morning, Luca's eyes were glassy. "No," Matteo whispered. Luca tried to smile. "It is nothing." Matteo knelt and felt his forehead. 8. The swell came by afternoon. It was almost merciful now in its predictability. Fever, swelling, delirium, death. The pattern had become a grim tutor. He moved Luca to the stern as they had moved Stefano weeks earlier. There was no priest left to murmur rites. Matteo said what he could remember. He no longer asked why. The Oxford scholars, reflecting on medieval responses, note how communities turn to familiar structures in times of crisis. Processions, confession, fasting. Disease threatened not only bodies, but the moral and social order. Ritual offered shape to chaos. Here on the open sea, ritual had thinned to memory. Luca died at sunset. 5 men remained. Matteo began to understand something he had resisted. They were not outrunning the sickness. They were carrying it forward. He remembered the first body flung over Caffa's wall, the smoke of the pyres, the smell on the wind. He remembered Paolo's whispered prayers, Stefano's last breath, Fra Luca's trembling smile, and he understood, slowly, reluctantly, that their flight had not severed the chain. It had lengthened it. Yet he could not condemn the decision to sail. What would he have done differently? Remain within Caffa's walls and die? Surrender to the Mongols? Wait for the fever to choose him? Survival is rarely pure. The sea remained deceptively calm. They sighted Corsica at a distance, but did not approach. Matteo feared any contact now, not for himself alone, but for those unseen faces along the shore. Fishermen mending nets, children running along the beach, human scale stakes. Always that. They adjusted course again, uncertain even of destination. Pisa had likely heard of Messina. Marseille perhaps too. Trade winds and trade rumors traveled together. On the 7th day west of Genoa, one of the older sailors, Pietro, spoke what the others had avoided. "We should scuttle her," he said quietly. "Take a boat. Go, separate ways." "And leave her drifting?" Matteo asked. "Better she sink." The ship had been home, refuge, escape. To imagine her sinking was to imagine the final severing of all connection. "If we scuttle her near shore," Pietro continued, "someone will find the wreckage. And if we scuttle her here?" Matteo gestured to the open water. Pietro did not answer. The debate lingered but resolved itself by exhaustion. They had no strength left for grand decisions, only for the next rope pulled, the next sail trimmed. 2 days later, Pietro sickened. 4. The number echoed in Matteo's mind. 4 men, adrift between shores that no longer welcomed them. That night, wind finally rose. Not a storm, not yet, but a steady push from the east. The sail filled sharply. The galley leaned. Matteo felt the shift like a verdict. They were being driven westward, toward Provence, toward Marseille. Hecker records that by early 1348, southern France would be stricken after ships from Italy arrived, bearing infection. Matteo did not know the calendar. He knew only that the coastline ahead would not remain untouched forever, whether by his ship or another. As dawn broke on the 10th day west of Genoa, land appeared faint on the horizon, low and pale. Arze d'Etol. The harbor was broad, busy, even at distance. Ships lay at anchor. Smoke rose from many hearths. Matteo felt dread mingle with something like relief. They had reached another node in the web. Whether they would be allowed to enter was another matter. As they approached, a signal flag rose from a watchtower. Stop. They slowed, uncertain. A patrol vessel rowed out, larger than those of Genoa, crewed by armed men. "State your origin," the officer shouted. Matteo hesitated only a moment. "Caffa, Dece." A murmur rippled across the patrol boat. "Remain where you are." The distance between them seemed vast. Behind Matteo, below deck, another cough began. 4 men stood on the deck of the galley. 4 men who had fled a siege. 4 men who had believed they were escaping. The sea between them and Marseille shimmered in the morning light. The officer conferred with his companions. Matteo gripped the clay rosary at his wrist. The bells of Marseille began to ring. They were not allowed to enter. The patrol vessel kept its distance, oars dipping in slow, deliberate rhythm. The officer who had shouted now stood with arms folded, studying the weathered Genoese hull, as though it were a diseased animal. "From Caffa?" he repeated. "Yes," Matteo said. "And Sicily?" A pause. "We passed Messina." The officer's jaw tightened. Behind him, a younger sailor crossed himself. "You will not approach the harbor," the officer said. "Provisions may be sent at distance." "No contact." Matteo nodded. The verdict felt familiar now. Not rejection. Containment. They drifted beyond the outer anchorage, neither admitted nor expelled entirely. Marseille's harbor lay open before them, vibrant and busy. Ships came and went under the watchful eyes of guards. Commerce persisted, cautious but unbroken. Another quiet contradiction. Fear had spread, but trade still moved. The patrol boat returned with barrels suspended on long ropes. The exchange was wordless. No hand touched hand. No rope crossed hull. From that distance, Matteo could hear faint sounds carried by wind, market cries, hammering from a shipyard, distant bells. Life continued. Behind him, Pietro's fever worsened. Matteo no longer pretended surprise at the pattern. He cleaned the older man's brow with seawater, and murmured the prayers Fra Luca had once spoken. "God does not forget," Pietro whispered. "I know," Matteo said. "Did he?" The sun sank red over the Provençal hills. Lights flickered along the shore. Matteo imagined the people within those houses, families at table, children laughing, merchants counting coin. He wondered how long before the first swelling appeared there. He did not need to wonder long. On the third day at anchor near Marseille, a boat arrived in haste from the harbor, its rowers urgent, breathless. A voice carried across the water. "Two men from the quay are sick." The officer's posture changed. "How?" he demanded. "They handled rope from an Italian vessel last week. Now they burn with fever." Matteo closed his eyes. Hecker would later write of the astonishing rapidity with which plague established itself once introduced to a port. It did not always require visible contact. It moved in ways that baffled contemporaries. Through goods, through crowded quarters, perhaps through creatures no one thought to fear. In 1347 and 1348, men spoke of corrupted air, of divine wrath, of poison. They did not speak of fleas. On the fourth day, Marseille barred its harbor. Chains were drawn across the inner entrance. Guards increased along the walls. Processions formed in the streets, men and women walking barefoot, carrying relics, chanting litanies. From the distance of the galley, Matteo could see a line of torches moving like a slow river of fire through the city. Religion did not retreat in crisis. It intensified. The Oxford historians describe how communities sought meaning in catastrophe, turning to collective prayer as both explanation and defense. The plague was read as sign and test. It was not an accident. Matteo watched the torchlight flicker and felt both comfort and unease. If this was a test, who was being examined? On the sixth day, Pietro died. 3. Die. The number narrowed. The crew gathered in silence as Matteo oversaw the burial. No one had strength left for ceremony. The sea accepted another body without ripple. Afterward, Matteo remained alone at the stern. He considered Pietro's suggestion. Scuttle her. If the ship sank here, perhaps the chain would break. But he remembered Messina, the dock worker who had fallen ill days after the Genoese were expelled. The Sicilian skiff that had brushed their hull. His mother's boat. The chain had already lengthened beyond this vessel. He could not undo what had begun in Caffa. The question shifted. What responsibility remains when ignorance has done its work? On the seventh day, Marseille reported more cases. Shouted fragments reached the galley across water. Families, entire households, stricken. Physicians overwhelmed. Some say God punishes pride. Matteo stared at the bustling city beyond the chain. Marseille was prosperous. Trade with Italy, Spain, North Africa, ... Ships from every shore. Prosperity had drawn them together. Prosperity had bound their fates. The officer returned once more. "You must leave," he said bluntly, before fear turns to violence. Matteo looked at the two remaining sailors beside him. 2 men, and himself. 3. Die. "Where?" Matteo asked, though he already knew there was no safe answer. "West," the officer said, "or south. Away from here. Away from here." The rope was cut again. The galley drifted slowly from the shadow of Marseille's walls. Behind them, bells rang without pause. As they cleared the outer anchorage, Matteo looked back one last time. Smoke rose from within the city, not from hearths alone. The chain across the harbor entrance glinted in the afternoon light. He turned the helm toward open sea. 3 men aboard. The wind carried them westward along the coast of Provence. The web tightened, and somewhere ahead, another harbor waited, unaware. They did not know where they were going anymore. West along the Provençal coast, then south again when fishing boats began to scatter at the sight of them. The galley's paint had peeled under salt and sun. The once proud banner of Genoa hung limp and faded. 3 men. Matteo, old Andrea, with a limp from an ore blister turned septic months before Caffa, and Tommaso, who had scarcely spoken since Sicily. They moved about the vessel like ghosts, inhabiting a memory. The sea had turned restless now, not violent, but unsettled, as if reflecting the agitation along every shore they passed. Wind pressed from the east, steady and insistent. Andrea spoke one evening as they shared the last of the dried beans. "It will not stop," he said. Matteo did not pretend confusion. "What will not?" "This." Andrea gestured vaguely. "To the sea, to the distant coastline, to the world beyond their hull. It has entered the ports. It will travel inland, along roads, through markets." Matteo nodded slowly. Hecker would later describe how once plague established itself in Mediterranean ports. It spread northward into France, and across trade routes with remarkable consistency, from Marseille into the Rhone Valley, from there to towns and monasteries that had never seen the sea. Matteo did not know the map in such detail. He felt only the inevitability. "Perhaps it will burn out," Tommaso said quietly. "Like a fire without wood." Andrea gave a faint smile. "There is much wood." They fell silent. At dawn, 2 days later, they sighted another harbor, smaller than Marseille, less fortified. A scatter of stone buildings climbed a low hill. Fishing nets hung to dry along the shore, a place that did not expect catastrophe. Matteo hesitated. If they avoided every port, they would starve. If they approached, they risked repeating the pattern. Responsibility weighed heavier than hunger. He turned the helm toward shore. The villagers did not raise chains. They had none. A few boats approached cautiously, curiosity overcoming fear. "From where?" called a fisherman. Matteo closed his eyes briefly before answering. "The Black Sea." It was not a lie. The fisherman exchanged glances with his companions. "News traveled slowly here." "You look thin," the fisherman said. "Storms." "Yes," Matteo answered. "Storms." Another quiet contradiction. They docked at the edge of the small quay. No officials came at once. No magistrates. Only ordinary men and women. Water was brought. Bread offered at arm's length. Matteo kept distance where he could. He warned them. "There is sickness in the east," he said. "In Sicily. In Italy. In Marseille." The fisherman shrugged uneasily. "There is always sickness somewhere." Perhaps that was true. That evening, Matteo walked alone along the edge of the village. He avoided crowds, though there were few. He watched smoke rise from chimneys. He listened to the low hum of ordinary life. He could not see the sickness here. That was what made it unbearable. On the second day in the harbor, Andrea began to cough. Matteo felt something inside him fracture. Not surprise, not even dread. Recognition. Andrea lasted 2 days. Tommaso lasted 3 more. Matteo buried them both at sea beyond the village's sight, rowing the small boat out alone. He whispered the prayers with no voice left for ceremony. 1 man remained aboard the galley. 1 man who had fled Caffa. 1 man who had watched Messina's harbor from a distance. 1 man who had seen Marseille chain itself shut. He returned to the small harbor alone. By then, the first villager had fallen ill. A child. Matteo heard the wailing from a stone house near the quay. He saw neighbors gather, uncertain whether to approach. He stood at the edge of the village and felt the full weight of it settle at last. It had not begun here. It had not begun with him, but it had arrived with him. Gasquet wrote of the bewilderment in towns newly struck, of how families struggled to understand the suddenness, the speed, of how physicians prescribed bloodletting and herbs with little effect, of how priests urged repentance. The pattern was repeating. Matteo returned to the galley and stood at the helm. He could sail again, carry the sickness further west, or he could end the vessel's journey here. He thought of Pietro's words, "Scuttle her." This time, there were no crew to debate. He gathered what little remained, his mother's rosary, a knife, a waterskin. He lowered the small boat into the water. Before leaving, he walked the length of the deck. He touched the mast, the worn benches, the railing where he had stood watching Caffa shrink into distance. He did not curse the ship. He did not bless it. He simply set a slow fire in the hold where pitch and rope would catch. Then he rowed. From the water, he watched the flames rise. The galley burned steadily, quietly. No explosion, no dramatic collapse, just wood surrendering to fire. Smoke curled into the evening sky. On shore, villagers pointed. Matteo rowed toward a stretch of empty beach beyond the harbor. He stepped onto sand alone. Behind him, the vessel that had carried him from Caffa sagged into the sea. The fire did not undo what had already spread. It did not cleanse Messina. It did not spare Genoa or Marseille. The web was already woven, but it ended this thread. Matteo stood on the shore and watched the last of the hull slip beneath the surface. The sea closed over it without comment. Ahead lay land, and whatever came next, the village did not drive him away. Not at once. Matteo expected stones, shouting, perhaps worse. He had seen enough fear to know how quickly it could harden into violence. Instead, there was uncertainty. The burning ship had been spectacle enough to keep distance between him and the quay. By the time the last timber slipped beneath the surface, villagers had retreated into doorways and behind shutters. Smoke drifted inland. Matteo did not approach the houses. He made shelter in a shallow hollow beyond the dunes, near scrub and low rock. The waterskin and knife were all he possessed now, besides the rosary wound around his wrist. The first night ash fell like fine gray snow. He lay awake listening. From the village came sounds he now recognized too easily. Coughing carried on still air. Low murmurs of prayer, a sudden cry cut short. He pressed his forehead into the sand. He had believed that scuttling the ship would sever the thread. Instead, he felt as though he had only removed the last visible proof. The next morning, a man approached from the village, stopping well short of Matteo's hollow. "You burned her," the man said. "Yes." "Why?" "She carried sickness." The man nodded slowly, absorbing the words as if tasting something bitter. "There is sickness here now," he said. Matteo did not reply. The man did not ask Matteo to leave, nor did he invite him closer. A line had been drawn without being marked. Over the following days, the pattern repeated. One house, then another. The small church bell tolled more often. A priest moved from doorway to doorway with hurried steps. Matteo watched from the dunes, neither inside nor entirely outside the village's fate. He could have fled inland, disappeared into hills and olive groves, but flight felt hollow now. He had outrun Caffa only to see Caffa bloom wherever he arrived. He remained. On the fourth day, a young woman stumbled from a house near the shore and collapsed on the path. Two neighbors approached, hesitated, then retreated. Matteo moved before he fully understood his choice. He crossed the invisible boundary and knelt beside her. Her skin burned beneath his palm. Her breathing was shallow. A swelling rose at her neck, unmistakable. She opened her eyes briefly. "Water," she whispered. He brought it from his waterskin. No one stopped him. Later, two men carried her back inside. They did not thank him. They did not curse him. They simply worked. The Oxford historians describe how in many towns, bonds strained, but did not always break. Some fled, some abandoned the sick, but others remained. Family, clergy, neighbors, tending as best they could within limited understanding. Matteo did not think of himself as noble. He had carried the sickness. Remaining felt less like virtue than reckoning. Days blurred. He helped carry bodies when called. He avoided unnecessary touch when he could. He washed his hands in seawater again and again, as if repetition might rewrite what had happened in Caffa. He did not fall ill. That fact unsettled him more than fever would have. Why them, and not me? He had asked it before at sea. Now it grew sharper. Some villagers whispered that perhaps he was protected. Others avoided him entirely, as if he himself were the vessel. One evening, as the sun sank behind the low hills, the village priest approached him beyond the dunes. "You are the sailor," the priest said. "Yes." "You came from the east." "Yes." The priest studied him carefully. "Do you believe this is punishment?" Matteo considered the question longer than he might once have done. "I do not know," he said at last. "Men were dying before we sailed. They died in Caffa. They died on the sea. They died in Messina. If it is punishment, it began far from here." The priest nodded slowly. "We preach repentance," he said. "We call for prayer. It is what we know to do." "And does it help?" Matteo asked. The priest's gaze drifted toward the village where another bell had begun to toll. "It helps the living endure," he said quietly. "Not cure. Endure." That distinction settled gently into Matteo's thoughts. Gasquet's accounts speak of clergy overwhelmed, of rites shortened by necessity, of mass graves when churchyards filled. Yet he also records letters from priests who continued their duties despite fear. In many places, faith did not provide explanation so much as framework. Matteo began attending the small services held outdoors when too many were ill to gather within the church. He stood at the edge, head bowed, rosary in hand. He did not ask for answers anymore. He asked for steadiness. Weeks passed. The sickness moved through the village like a tide, rising sharply, cresting, then slowly receding. Not gone, never entirely gone, but less constant. Some houses remained dark, others reopened. Life did not return as before. It rearranged itself. Fewer voices at market, fewer children at play, but bread baked again. Fishermen mended nets. The priest rang the bell not only for death, but for ordinary hours. Matteo remained through it all, no longer fleeing, no longer sailing. He helped rebuild a collapsed wall near the shore. He repaired a fishing skiff with hands that had once trimmed sails bound for distant ports. He had been a thread in a web that spanned seas. Now his world narrowed to one stretch of coast. Yet even here, news filtered in slowly. Travelers spoke of Genoa stricken, of Florence overwhelmed, of Marseille's processions turning into funerals. Hecker's later chronicle would chart these movements with somber precision. Matteo heard them as fragments, each confirming what he already felt. The web had tightened across Europe, and no ship alone had done it. One evening, months after the galley burned, Matteo stood on the shore where its ashes had scattered. The sea lay calm again, as it had been the day he left Caffa. He no longer mistook calm for mercy. He understood it as indifference. Behind him, the village breathed in smaller measure than before. Ahead, beyond the horizon, other coasts endured their own reckonings. Matteo did not know how long the sickness would last. He did not know whether it would claim him eventually. He did not know whether God weighed his survival as gift or burden. He knew only this. He had fled death. He had carried it. He had remained. And the world continued, altered, quieter, but not ended. The bells rang for evening prayer. Matteo closed his eyes and listened, not for explanation, but for the simple fact of sound. Autumn came softly to the coast. The heat thinned. The sea darkened to a deeper blue. Olive leaves flickered silver in the breeze. Matteo marked the passing weeks not by calendar but by harvest. The fishermen bringing in heavier nets. The women pressing oil from crushed fruit. The sickness did not vanish with summer, but it changed. Where once it had struck swiftly, and in clusters, now it appeared sporadically. One house, then silence, then another. The bell rang less often. When it did, the villagers no longer froze in collective dread. They bowed their heads and carried on. Loss had become woven into routine. Matteo felt that weaving inside himself. He no longer started at every cough. He no longer scanned his skin at dawn with the same desperate vigilance. He still checked, out of habit, but the ritual had lost its edge. He remained unmarked. That fact had begun to feel like something heavier than survival. One afternoon, as he helped mend nets beside the shore, the fisherman who had first allowed them water sat down beside him. "You did not leave," the man said. "No, you could have." "Yes." The fisherman studied the horizon. "Some did." When the sickness began, Matteo nodded. He had seen shuttered houses remain shuttered, families slipping away inland before the tide crested. "And you?" the fisherman asked. "I have fled enough." The fisherman did not press further. In the evenings, Matteo sometimes spoke with the priest beneath the small portico of the church. They did not debate doctrine. They spoke of endurance. "There are fewer children now," the priest said once, voice quiet. "Yes." "Fewer old men as well." "Yes." "But the middle remains," the priest continued. "Those who must build again." Matteo understood. Gasquet's Chronicle of England would later record similar observations. Fields left untended for lack of laborers, rents falling, wages rising for those who survived. The plague did not only take lives, it rearranged societies. It loosened old bonds, tightened others. Even in this small village, subtle shifts emerged. The fisherman's daughter now managed accounts once kept by an uncle who had died. A widow oversaw a boat repair yard with steady competence. Young men who might once have inherited little now found opportunity in empty places. Death had carved space. Matteo did not know whether to call that mercy or consequence. Travelers passing through brought more distant news. Genoa had suffered heavily. Entire quarters emptied. Florence overwhelmed. Pisa grieving. Marseille shaken. The web had tightened across Italy and France. Inland towns along the Rhone had been struck. Monasteries had lost half their brethren. Hecker's later account would lay out the spread like a map of advancing shadow. But here it came as fragments, names of cities spoken with lowered voices. Matteo listened without surprise. One evening, months after the galley had burned, a merchant caravan passed along the coastal road. They paused in the village square to water their animals. One of the merchants approached Matteo cautiously. "You are the Genoese sailor?" he asked. "I was." The merchant studied him. "They say ships from Caffa brought the pestilence." Matteo felt the old weight settle again. "They say many things," he replied. "Is it true?" Matteo considered. In Caffa, bodies had flown over walls. Men had sickened before ships departed. Trade had linked Crimea to Constantinople, to Sicily, to Italy, long before he set sail. "We fled," Matteo said slowly. "The sickness traveled with us, but it did not begin with us." The merchant nodded, unsatisfied but thoughtful. History, Matteo realized, would seek causes. It would seek points of origin. It would look for ships and names and ports. But those who had lived it knew how tangled the threads were. That night, Matteo walked alone along the beach. The sea lay calm again. He had once mistaken calm for safety. Now he saw it as the world's steady rhythm, indifferent to human upheaval. He knelt and pressed his hand into the wet sand. He tried to remember the precise moment when he might have chosen differently. Remain in Caffa, refuse to board, turn back from Messina. But each memory dissolved into the same truth. Men act with the knowledge they have. Ignorance is not innocence, but it is not malice either. The open loop that had haunted him since Caffa returned in quieter form. Had he escaped death, or had death chosen him as instrument? The question no longer burned. It lingered. Behind him, the village bells rang for Compline. He rose and turned toward the sound. Life continued, altered, reduced, resilient. Thought. Matteo did not know whether he would ever sail again. The thought no longer stirred longing. The horizon that had once beckoned now seemed vast and unnecessary. He found steadiness in smaller tasks, mending nets, repairing boats, carrying grain. The web of trade that had once defined his life had revealed its shadow. He would not sever himself entirely from it. No one could. Goods would move again. Ships would sail. Commerce would resume with cautious vigor. But something had shifted inside him. He had seen how tightly human lives were bound across distance. He had seen how quickly prosperity could become conduit. He had seen how faith could sustain without explaining. The autumn wind carried the scent of pressed olives. The sea breathed in and out. Matteo stood between them, neither absolved nor condemned, simply present. Winter did not bring an ending. It brought quiet. The village shrank inward as cold settled along the coast. Fishing slowed. Nets stiffened with frost at dawn. Smoke rose thicker from chimneys. People spoke in lower tones, as if loud voices might disturb something fragile. The sickness did not disappear, but it no longer roared. It flickered. One house here, a solitary burial there. Matteo marked the season by absence more than presence. The spaces where men had once stood at market, the empty stool in the church, the boat that had not returned because its master had died in early autumn. The priest once said, "It helps the living endure." Matteo began to understand that endurance was not triumph. It was simply continuation. Travelers brought news, even through winter roads. Florence had suffered grievously. Entire households lost. Clergy overwhelmed. Gasquet would later record similar devastation in England. Parishes emptied, benefices vacant, fields untended. Matteo heard it in fragments, through merchants warming themselves at village hearths. In some towns, one traveler said, half are gone. Matteo did not ask which half. Another spoke of penitential processions in cities further north. Men walking barefoot, whipping themselves in public squares, pleading for divine mercy. The Oxford historians would later describe how movements of extreme piety arose in response to catastrophe, as communities sought visible repentance. Here in the small coastal village, there were no such dramatic displays. There were prayers. There was bread. There was grief. Matteo sometimes walked beyond the village to a low rise, overlooking the sea. From there, he could see a wide arc of horizon. He imagined the routes he had once sailed: Crimea, Constantinople, Messina, Genoa, Tartary, Arze d'Etol. Each port, a bead on a string. Each string, part of a wider web. He wondered how many ships had followed similar paths after his own burned. How many sailors had carried stories, east and west? How many believed, as he once had, that departure meant safety? The open loop returned gently. Had it mattered that he burned the galley? He no longer asked whether it stopped the spread. It had not. But perhaps it mattered for another reason. It had ended his flight. One afternoon, as frost edged the shoreline, the fisherman approached him again. "There is talk," the man said, "that wages have risen in larger towns. Too many hands lost." Matteo nodded. "Yes," the fisherman continued. "Merchants seeking labor, fields needing men." "You will go?" Matteo asked. The fisherman shook his head. "This is my shore." Matteo felt the simplicity of that answer settle into him. Once, his shore had been every harbor. Now it was this strip of coast. In the village square, a young widow had taken over her husband's trade in salt fish. She negotiated firmly with passing merchants. No one challenged her authority. The old patterns had shifted. Death had carved space, not only for grief, but for change. Hecker's later narrative would trace mortality across regions, estimating losses in numbers that staggered comprehension. Matteo did not know numbers. He knew faces, faces absent, faces enduring, faces reshaped by necessity. As winter deepened, Matteo fell ill, not with swelling, not with fever, but with exhaustion. He slept heavily for 3 days, waking only to drink water brought by the priest. His body ached. His dreams were filled with sails collapsing, bells ringing without pause. When he rose, thin but steady, he understood something else. Survival does not grant immunity from weariness. The priest visited him by the hearth. "You feared the greater illness," the priest said. "Yes, and instead you met this." Matteo gave a faint smile. "I would have chosen this." "Choice," the priest said softly, "is smaller than we think." They sat in silence. Outside, snow dusted the low hills. The sea remained dark and patient. Matteo's mother never came. He had not seen her since the night her skiff touched the hull in Genoa's harbor. He did not know whether she had fallen ill, whether she had survived. He imagined her sometimes, standing in her narrow street, rosary in hand, listening to bells. He did not know whether he had protected her by refusing her touch, or denied her a final embrace. That uncertainty would remain. Winter thinned at last. The first green shoots appeared among the scrub near the dunes. The village breathed more easily. News arrived that in some cities, the sickness had receded sharply. In others, it lingered. The web had pulsed with devastation, and was now settling into quieter patterns. Trade would resume more fully in spring. It always did. Ships would sail. Merchants would bargain. Life, altered but persistent, would move again along the same routes that had carried silk, grain, and death alike. Matteo stood once more on the rise overlooking the sea. The horizon was clear. He no longer felt the urge to chase it. He had been a sailor at the edge of empire. He had become a man at the edge of a village. The difference felt less dramatic than he once would have imagined. The world had not ended. It had shifted, and in that shift, Matteo found no neat answer. Only the steady sound of waves against shore. Spring did not ask permission to return. It arrived in small declarations, green along the hills, birds threading the air above the shoreline, fishing boats venturing farther from harbor with cautious confidence. The village did not celebrate the season as it once might have. There were fewer voices to mark it, yet there was relief, quiet, and almost shy. The bell rang less for death. It rang more for the hour. Matteo found himself rising before dawn out of habit, rather than necessity. He walked the beach where the galley had burned months before. The sea had erased any visible sign of it. No charred timber washed ashore. No iron fittings surfaced in the shallows. The vessel that had carried him from Caffa was gone as completely as if it had never existed. History would remember the ships from the Crimea. Chroniclers would write of the siege, of bodies hurled over walls, of vessels that fled and spread disease along trade routes. Hecker's later account would trace that path in sober lines. But this particular galley, this deck, these benches, these men, would not survive in ink, only in memory. And memory had already begun to soften at the edges. Travelers brought broader news, as roads reopened. In northern Italy, cities counted their dead in proportions, rather than names. 1 in 3, perhaps more. In some towns, nearly half. The Oxford scholars would later note how demographic collapse altered not just households, but institutions. Churches struggling to fill parishes, monasteries reduced to skeletal communities, civic councils reshaped by absence. Matteo listened. He did not try to calculate numbers. He pictured faces, his mother's face. One afternoon, as fishermen unloaded their catch, a merchant caravan arrived from Genoa. Matteo stood apart as the men unburdened their mules. He watched, heart steady but heavy. A merchant recognized his accent when he spoke to the priest. "You are Genoese," the merchant said, studying him. "I was. There are many fewer of you now," the merchant replied without cruelty. Matteo inclined his head. "Do you know a woman named Lucia di Ruggiero?" Matteo asked quietly. "She lived near the harbor." The merchant searched his memory. "There was much loss," he said slowly. "But I recall the harbor quarter suffered heavily." He did not say more. He did not need to. Matteo nodded once. He felt neither shock nor sudden grief, only a settling. The open loop that had once burned, had he escaped death, or carried it, shifted again. Perhaps he had not escaped it at all. Perhaps death had moved alongside him, touching some, sparing others, indifferent to his intentions. The priest found him later by the dunes. "You have heard news," the priest said gently. "Yes." They stood without speaking. "Do you regret burning the ship?" the priest asked after a time. Matteo considered. "No," he said at last, "but I do not imagine it saved anyone." "Not everything done is measured by what it saves," the priest replied. That thought lingered. Summer approached again. The village grew louder, though never as before. Children born in late spring began to cry in stone houses where silence had once lingered. A wedding took place in the square, muted but genuine. Life did not restore what had been. It rearranged itself around absence. Gasquet would later write of England's fields left fallow, of wages rising, of social tension in the wake of mortality. The plague's consequences extended beyond the fever itself. Matteo sensed that truth, even here in miniature. The widow who managed the salt fish trade now negotiated with confidence. Young men who might once have waited years for inheritance found themselves stewards sooner than expected. Labor held new value. The web had not only tightened in death, it would shift in life. One evening, nearly a year since Caffa, Matteo walked alone to the rise overlooking the sea. The horizon lay clear beneath a wide, pale sky. He tried to recall the exact moment he had stepped onto the galley in Caffa's harbor. The smoke rising, the bells tolling, the sense of escape. He remembered believing that distance could outrun disaster. He no longer believed that. Trade had bound ports together long before plague traveled along those same routes. Prosperity and vulnerability had grown side by side. The web was not new, only its shadow had been revealed. Matteo did not curse trade. He did not curse the sea. He did not curse Caffa. He understood now that men move goods because they must. They seek livelihood. They build networks because isolation is poverty, and those same networks carry consequences no one intends. The quiet contradiction remained. The sea, beautiful and indifferent, had borne both silk and death. Matteo stood with the rosary still wound around his wrist, its clay beads worn smooth by a year of restless fingers. He did not ask whether he had been instrument or survivor. He asked instead whether he could live honestly within the web he now understood. The village bell rang once for evening prayer. He turned toward the sound. The world beyond the horizon would continue to reckon with loss. Cities would rebuild. Chronicles would be written. The plague would move northward, westward, inward. He would not witness all of it. He would mend nets. He would carry grain. He would stand at the edge of the sea and listen to bells. And somewhere in the memory of distant ports, a ship from Caffa would be remembered as the beginning, even if the beginning had begun long before. By the second summer after Caffa, the village no longer spoke of the sailor as an omen. He was simply Matteo. The word plague had settled into memory, not forgotten, but less sharp. People no longer crossed themselves at his passing. They asked him to help repair boats. They shared bread without hesitation. He accepted this without relief. Memory, he had learned, fades unevenly. In some hearts it burns for years. In others it softens into story within a season. News from inland towns spoke of waves, of the sickness returning in places thought safe, then receding again. The web pulsed, not in a single motion but in cycles. Hecker would later note how plague did not strike once and vanish, but revisited communities in intervals, reshaping generations. Matteo listened with a kind of quiet vigilance. He had once mistaken departure for control. Now he understood that no man steers the wind. One evening, as the sun settled low in gold along the sea, a small vessel appeared on the horizon. Matteo felt a flicker inside him. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The sail was patched, the hull worn. A trader. The village gathered loosely at the quay as the boat approached. No chains barred entry here. No armed patrols waited. The trader called greetings. Spoke of markets reopening in cities once ravaged. Of ships again, departing Genoa, under cautious optimism. Life returns, the trader declared. Returns. The word unsettled Matteo. Life does not return unchanged. It resumes with scars. The trader disembarked and began bargaining for salt fish. Laughter even rose briefly in the square. Matteo watched from a distance. He saw in the trader's eager gestures the same energy he himself had once carried in Caffa. Confidence in roots, in goods, in movement. He did not begrudge it. Commerce had not created the plague, but it had carried it, as all things carried by human connection are carried. Later that night, the priest found Matteo on the shore. "You watch the ships as if they speak," the priest said. "They do," Matteo replied. "And what do they say?" "That nothing ends. It only moves." The priest considered this. "Does that comfort you?" Matteo looked at the dark water, faint starlight trembling across its surface. No. They stood together in silence. The Oxford historians write of how the Black Death altered medieval consciousness, not only through mortality but through awareness of fragility. Institutions once assumed stable proved vulnerable. Yet, belief itself did not collapse. In many places it deepened, became more personal, more urgent. Matteo felt something like that deepening within himself. He no longer prayed for protection from distant catastrophe. He prayed for steadiness within whatever came. He prayed for the dead he had known, Paolo, Stefano, Fra Luca, Pietro, Luca, Tommaso. He prayed for his mother without knowing her fate. He prayed without demanding explanation. That shift felt small, but it was real. As summer waned, Matteo made a decision he had postponed for months. He would travel once more, not by sea, by road. He wished to know whether Genoa still stood, whether his mother's street held any familiar shape. The village did not protest his departure. The fisherman clasped his shoulder. The widow pressed dried figs into his pack. The priest gave him a blessing. "You have endured," the priest said. "That is not nothing." Matteo nodded. He did not know whether endurance was virtue or simply accident. He walked north along the coast, then inland where roads permitted. He saw towns diminished, but breathing, fields worked by fewer hands, monasteries quieter. In one town he saw a row of fresh graves outside the churchyard wall, too many for the space within. Gasquet would later describe similar overflow in English parishes. Here, Matteo saw only earth freshly turned. He did not linger. As he neared Genoa, his steps slowed. The city rose from the coast much as it had before. Stone terraces, cathedral tower, harbor busy though not crowded. He stood at a distance first. He did not know whether he feared what he would find, or feared finding nothing changed. When he entered the harbor quarter, he saw shutters repaired, doors repainted, fewer voices in the street, but life unmistakably present. He walked toward his childhood home. The door stood closed. He knocked. A stranger opened it. "Yes?" "Lucia di Ruggiero lived here," Matteo said. The stranger's face softened. "She died last year," the man said quietly. "The fever." Matteo nodded once. "I am her son." The stranger hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in," he said. Inside, the room felt smaller than Matteo remembered. The shrine to St. Roch still hung on the wall. The clay bowl his mother had used remained on the shelf. He stood in the space where her bed had been. He felt no dramatic collapse, no sudden cry, only the settling of something long anticipated. He had not saved her by refusing her touch. He had not condemned her by sailing from Caffa. The web had been wider than both of them. He left the house before nightfall. Outside, Genoa's bells rang. They did not ring only for death. They rang for the hour. Matteo stood in the narrow street and listened. The question that had begun on Caffa's wall returned one last time. Had he escaped death, or had death traveled with him? He did not answer it. He turned instead toward the harbor. Ships still moved in and out, cautious but determined. The sea lay beyond, vast and indifferent. And somewhere, in some chronicle yet unwritten, a ship from Caffa would be remembered as the beginning. Matteo knew now that beginnings are rarely singular. They are threads pulled taut within webs we barely see. He stood beneath the ringing bells and allowed that uncertainty to remain. Matteo did not remain in Genoa. He stayed long enough to arrange a small stone in the churchyard bearing his mother's name. Not an elaborate monument, just a marker. He paid for it with coin he had earned mending nets and hauling grain in a village far from home. When the stone was set, he stood before it alone. "I came back," he said quietly. He did not apologize. He did not defend himself. There was nothing left to argue. The harbor called to him as it always had. The scent of tar and rope, the cry of gulls circling masts, the low thrum of commerce returning to life. Ships departed daily now, fewer than before the pestilence, but steady. Trade with Catalonia resumed cautiously. Vessels bound for Venice and Pisa carried wool and grain. The web had not been torn apart. It had tightened. Matteo stood at the edge of the quay and watched a galley prepare to sail east. For a moment, the old impulse stirred. A memory of youth, of open horizons and coin earned by calloused hands. He did not board. Instead, he turned inland once more. The world had widened too quickly before. Now he chose narrower paths. He walked through towns still bearing scars, houses abandoned, guild halls quieter, monasteries missing familiar faces. He saw laborers bargaining for higher wages, landowners uneasy at new expectations. Gasquet's later accounts would speak of these shifts in England, of statutes attempting to bind workers to former wages, of tensions rising from absence and necessity. Here in Italy the signs were similar, though less codified. The balance had shifted. Survival carried new leverage. Matteo observed without judgment. He no longer believed catastrophe came with singular cause. It emerged from conditions long prepared, crowded ports, moving goods, unseen vermin, faith-seeking meaning. He reached the coastal village by late autumn. The fishermen embraced him without ceremony. "You found what you sought?" the man asked. "I found what remained," Matteo replied. That winter passed more gently. The sickness flared in neighboring towns, but did not return to the village with the same fury. When isolated cases appeared, they were met with caution, not panic. Doors closed briefly, then reopened. Life had learned something, perhaps not understanding, but rhythm. The priest spoke in sermons less of wrath and more of humility. The village gathered without spectacle, without self-punishment. The Oxford historians would later note that after the first wave of plague, religiosity did not collapse. It transformed. Practices deepened in some places, simplified in others. Matteo sensed that quiet transformation in the way prayers were spoken, not louder, not more desperate, but steadier. He took up small responsibilities within the village, helping manage fishing rotations, repairing a communal storehouse roof, tasks that required attention but not glory. One evening, as wind rattled shutters, a young boy approached him by the dunes. "Is it true," the boy asked, "that you sailed from the place where the sickness began?" Matteo considered the phrasing. "It did not begin where I sailed," he said gently. "It had begun long before." "But you saw it first?" the boy pressed. "I saw it early," Matteo admitted. "Were you afraid?" "Yes." "Are you afraid now?" Matteo looked at the horizon. "Yes," he said again. The boy frowned. "But it is quieter now." "Yes." "Then why?" Matteo knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "Because the world is wider than this shore," he said, "and we are bound to it." The boy absorbed this without fully understanding. He would grow into that understanding in his own time. As the second year since Caffa drew toward its end, travelers spoke of plague reaching further north, into lands Matteo had never seen, across the Alps, into German towns, toward England. Hecker's chronicle would mark those advances with grim progression. Matteo felt the distant tremor, but no longer the shock. The web continued to pulse. He walked again to the rise overlooking the sea, the same sea that had borne silk, spices, the same sea that had borne sickness, the same sea that now lay calm beneath a pale winter sky. He understood at last that calm and catastrophe coexist without contradiction. The sea does not choose what it carries. Men do not foresee all they set in motion. He stood there long after the light faded. The open loop had softened into something less urgent. He would never know whether he had been instrument or bystander, survivor or conduit. History would remember ships and ports. It would count the dead in vast, incomprehensible numbers. It would assign beginnings and routes. But within those lines, there would be men like Paolo and Stefano, women like Lucia, villages that endured, children who asked questions at the edge of dunes. No need moral would rise from it. Only this: human lives are bound together across distance. What moves between us does not ask our intention. And yet, Within that binding, there remains choice, whether to flee endlessly or to remain and endure. Matteo chose to remain. The bells rang for evening prayer. He did not ask the sea for forgiveness. He did not ask it for mercy. He listened to its steady breathing and allowed the uncertainty to stand. The third spring after Caffa arrived without ceremony. No herald marked its coming. No proclamation declared that the worst had passed. Yet the air felt lighter, as if the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. In the village, nets were cast farther out. Boats returned with fuller hauls. The square held more voices again, still fewer than before, but no longer hushed. The plague had not vanished from the world. Travelers continued to speak of distant flare-ups, towns in the north revisited by fever, monasteries thinned again by loss. Hecker's later chronicle would note these recurrences with sober clarity. The Black Death was not a single blow, but a season that lingered, returning in lesser waves. Matteo understood now that what they had lived through was not an event bounded neatly by months. It was a reshaping. He no longer scanned faces for signs of swelling. He scanned them for resilience. One afternoon, the young boy who had once asked him about fear returned with another question. "Will it come back?" the boy asked, sitting beside Matteo on the dune. "It may," Matteo said. The boy frowned. "Then what do we do?" Matteo looked toward the village, toward the widow managing her trade, the fisherman repairing his skiff, the priest walking slowly between houses. "We live," he said. "That is all? That is not small." The boy seemed dissatisfied, but he nodded. In the evenings, Matteo began teaching a handful of young men how to mend sails properly. Not fishing nets, but true canvas meant for longer journeys. Word had spread that trade along the coast would soon increase. Smaller ports would supply larger ones. Goods would move again. "You do not wish to sail?" one of the young men asked him. Matteo smiled faintly. "I have sailed enough." The young man laughed, assuming modesty. Matteo did not explain. He could still tie knots, blindfolded. He could still judge wind by scent. But the horizon no longer held promise for him. It held memory. One evening, a modest trading vessel anchored offshore. The captain came ashore seeking dried fish and olive oil. Matteo watched him bargain, quick, efficient, confident. "From where?" Matteo asked when the deal was done. "From Barcelona," the captain replied. "We trade along the coast. Genoa, Pisa, Marseille. Slowly, carefully." "Has the sickness eased?" Matteo asked. "In some places," the captain said. "In others, it lingers. But ships sail again. Ships sail again." The web tightening once more. Matteo did not flinch at the thought. He had come to see the web as neither curse nor blessing. It was simply the way men lived, bound across distance by need and ambition. The plague had revealed its cost. It had not erased its necessity. Later that night, Matteo walked to the shore alone. He traced the line where his galley had burned years before. The sea was unchanged, tireless in its motion. He remembered standing on Caffa's wall, smelling smoke, watching bodies arc through the air. He remembered believing that escape lay in departure. He remembered stepping onto Messina's quay, relief flooding him. He remembered his mother's hand reaching across the gap in Genoa's harbor. He remembered the moment the hull had caught fire. These memories no longer surged with accusation. They lay within him like stones smoothed by tide. He could not untangle cause from coincidence. He could not assign singular blame. He could not absolve himself entirely either. Ignorance does not erase consequence, but neither does consequence erase humanity. The priest joined him quietly. "You stand here often," the priest said. "Yes." "Do you seek something?" Matteo considered. "Not anymore," he said. "What then?" "To remember." The priest nodded. "Memory is a kind of prayer," he said. They stood together, watching the horizon fade into dust. In larger cities, chronicles were being written, lists of the dead compiled, explanations offered. Some would blame foreigners. Some would blame sin. Some would search for natural causes in corrupted air. Centuries later, scholars would identify rats, fleas, bacteria, patterns invisible to medieval eyes. But in this moment, none of that clarity existed. There was only lived experience. Men and women bound across ports and villages. Fear and faith intertwined. Trade and vulnerability inseparable. Matteo turned the rosary beads around his wrist one final time that evening. He did not pray for protection. He prayed for humility. The bells rang for night prayer. He listened without asking what tomorrow would bring. The world beyond the dunes continued its slow rearrangement, and the sea, breathed in and out, as it always had. Years did not erase the memory of 1347. They thinned it, like cloth worn smooth at the elbows. The sharpness dulled, but the shape remained. The village children who had once asked Matteo about fear grew taller. Some apprenticed under fishermen. Others spoke of traveling inland where wages were rumored higher, where labor was sought and coin offered more freely than before the great mortality. The world had shifted. In Genoa and Florence, councils adjusted laws to bind workers to former wages. In some places, resistance stirred. Gasquet would later describe such tensions in England. The statute of laborers attempting to fix pay in a landscape transformed by loss. Matteo did not know statutes by name, but he understood imbalance when he saw it. Scarcity grants leverage. He saw it when a young widow negotiated a fair price for her catch. He saw it when a farmer refused to till land without reasonable terms. The old hierarchies bent, not broken, but bent. Trade expanded cautiously along the coast. Smaller ports like this one gained modest importance as larger cities recovered unevenly. Matteo occasionally assisted captains in repairing sails before departure. He worked efficiently, without nostalgia. "Why do you never sail with us?" a captain once asked, admiring the neat precision of Matteo's knots. "I have sailed enough," Matteo replied again. The captain laughed, assuming modesty. Matteo did not correct him. On certain evenings when wind blew from the east, carrying faint scents of distant shores, he felt a flicker of something like longing, not for coin, not for adventure, but for the clarity of a defined path. The illusion that steering a vessel meant steering fate. He no longer believed that illusion. He walked instead to the rise above the dunes and watched ships pass in the far distance, white against the deepening blue. Somewhere beyond that horizon, plague still flickered across regions, not with the ferocity of the first years, but persistently, returning in lesser waves, as Hecker would later document. The Black Death had become part of the landscape of Europe, not a single catastrophe, but a presence that reappeared across generations. Matteo understood that the web he had glimpsed in terror would endure. Men would continue to move goods and stories, and faith across its threads. And sometimes, unseen, other things would move with them. One late autumn afternoon, a young man from the village prepared to depart aboard a coastal trader bound for Pisa. His mother wept softly at the quay. Matteo stood beside them. "Will you tell him not to go?" the mother asked Matteo. He looked at the young man. Strong, eager, eyes bright with ambition. "What would I tell him?" Matteo asked gently. "That the sea carries death," she whispered. Matteo glanced toward the horizon. "The sea carries everything," he said. "Grain, salt, dari, news, sometimes sickness, but it is not the sea that chooses." The mother looked unconvinced. Matteo turned to the young man. "Learn the winds," he said. "Keep distance when illness is rumored. Listen to port authorities. And remember that what binds us across distance also makes us vulnerable." The young man nodded solemnly. He would not fully understand until experience carved the lesson deeper. The vessel cast off. Matteo watched until it dwindled to a speck. He did not feel dread. He felt awareness. Life could not shrink to one shore forever. The web demanded movement, and movement carried risk. As evening fell, the priest joined him. "You counsel departure now?" the priest asked with a faint smile. "I counsel caution," Matteo replied. "And hope?" Matteo considered. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Hope as well." The priest nodded. "Faith without hope hardens," he said. "Hope without caution blinds." Matteo appreciated the balance in that. The bells rang for vespers. The sound carried across water and dunes, steady and familiar. Matteo closed his eyes. He no longer sought to answer the question that had haunted him since Caffa. He had escaped death. He had carried it. He had endured it. All of these were true. History would remember ships and routes. Scholars would trace patterns. Preachers would draw moral lessons. But within the quiet spaces between those larger narratives were lives like his, uncertain, imperfect, bound across distance by necessity and love. The sea darkened beneath the falling light. Matteo opened his eyes. The world remained unfinished. The web still trembled. And tomorrow, as always, would arrive without asking whether men were ready. The years folded quietly over the memory of Caffa. Not enough to erase it, enough to change its shape. Matteo grew older on the same stretch of coast where his galley had burned. His hair thinned. His hands, once hardened by oars and rigging, thickened instead with the steady labor of rope and net. Children who had not yet been born when the first wave of pestilence struck now ran along the shore without fear. They knew the word plague, as children know storms or famine, something spoken of by elders, something that belonged to story and caution, but not to their own breath. Trade continued. It never fully ceased. Ships arrived bearing woolen and wine, olive oil and salt fish. They departed with cargo secured and sails trimmed carefully, captains mindful of rumor. Quarantine, once improvised in fear, became more deliberate in some ports. 40 days at anchor before disembarkation. A measured pause where once there had been only panic. Human beings learn, even when they do not understand entirely what they are learning. The Oxford historians would later describe how institutions adapted, how cities formalized practices, how communities incorporated memory into policy. The web did not unravel. It adjusted its tension. Matteo watched these changes with quiet recognition. He had once believed that the ship from Caffa marked a beginning. He now understood it had been one thread among many. The sickness had moved along trade routes, because trade routes already existed, because ports had been bound together for generations, because prosperity demanded contact. No single sailor carried Europe's fate, and yet each sailor carried responsibility within his own reach. That distinction had taken years to settle in him. One late summer evening, Matteo stood again on the rise above the dunes. The sea lay wide and luminous, beneath a sky fading toward indigo. A distant vessel moved slowly along the horizon, its sail pale against the darkening blue. He could not tell where it had come from, or where it was bound. He no longer tried. Behind him, the village bell rang for Compline. The sound drifted outward, met by the steady hush of waves. He thought of Caffa, of the siege fires, of the first body flung over stone walls. He thought of Messina's harbor, of Genoa's guarded distance, of Marseille's chained entrance. He thought of his mother's hand, reaching across a narrow gap. He felt no accusation in these memories now, only continuity. The plague had taken much. It had altered cities, reordered labor, shaken faith, deepened it in others. It had exposed the web beneath ordinary life, the invisible threads binding distant ports, households, and prayers. Matteo had once searched for a neat answer. Had he escaped death, or carried it? Had burning the ship mattered? Had refusing his mother's touch saved her, or only spared him guilt? The years had not answered these questions. They had thinned their urgency. He had come to see that human lives unfold within currents far larger than intention. Men act with limited sight. They choose as best they can within narrow knowledge. Consequences travel further than foresight. And yet, within that vastness, small choices remain. To remain when flight becomes habit. To help when fear urges retreat. To mend what can be mended, even if it does not undo what has been done. He closed his eyes and listened to the sea, the same sea that had borne silk and spice, the same sea that had borne sickness, the same sea that now reflected starlight as if nothing had ever troubled its surface. Calm and catastrophe had never contradicted one another. They had always coexisted. The bell rang again. Matteo opened his eyes. In the distance, the vessel on the horizon dipped briefly behind a swell, then reappeared. Ships would continue to sail. Ports would continue to trade. Plague would visit again in years to come, though never quite as before. Chroniclers would write of routes and dates. Settlers centuries later would trace bacteria and fleas with clarity Matteo's world could not imagine. But here, on this stretch of coast, what endured was simpler. A man who had fled, a man who had carried, a man who had remained. He did not ask the sea for absolution. He did not claim innocence. He stood within the web he now understood, and accepted that it bound him to both suffering and sustenance. The wind shifted gently from the west. The distant sail altered course. Matteo turned from the horizon and walked back toward the village lights. The world beyond the dunes remained unfinished, uncertain, alive, and the question that had once burned like fever now rested quietly in his chest, unanswered and unresolvable. The last ship from Caffa had long since vanished beneath the sea, but the threads it had traveled remained, drawn tight across continents, across faith, across memory. The bells fell silent, the sea breathed, and the story did not close.